Scene 1, a new legend arrives. A dusty train station in Oshkosh, Nebraska, 1914. The late afternoon sun casts long shadows over the platform, its wooden planks worn from years of travel. The steam from the train hisses loudly, mixing with the distant murmur of passengers disembarking. Horses tied to posts flick their tails against flies, and the smell of coal smoke lingers in the crisp autumn air. A thick-set man with long black braids steps down from the train. His boots land firmly on the platform, sending a soft thud through the wood. He wears a long, dark coat, buttoned up against the chill, and carries a small, well-worn leather bag. His eyes scan the bustling station with an air of authority, a confident smirk playing at his lips. He knows exactly how this will unfold. Every American town had a weakness, a hunger for legend, for stories of bravery and betrayal. And wherever he went, Ben McIntosh made sure to feed them one. A few townsfolk pause their conversations, glancing his way. He stands out not just because of his appearance but because of the quiet confidence he exudes. A lone man, standing against the backdrop of a restless world, filled with the kind of mystery that makes people curious. A local man, dressed in dusty overalls and a weathered hat, stops in his tracks. His brow furrows as recognition sparks in his mind. He takes a hesitant step forward, then another, his voice catching with excitement. "Local man, excited, say, aren't you?" McIntosh turns his gaze toward the man, his face unreadable for a moment. Then, with a slow and solemn nod, he gives him exactly what he's waiting for. McIntosh, nodding solemnly, Curley. Curley the Crow. Scout for General Custer himself. A ripple moves through the station. Murmurs turn to gasps. People exchange whispers, excitement bubbling just beneath the surface. A woman clutching a basket of apples leans toward her husband, eyes wide with wonder. A young boy tugs at his father's sleeve, his gaze locked onto the imposing figure before them. He never had to announce it himself. All he had to do was let them believe. A group of men near the saloon doorway glance at each other. One spits his tobacco onto the ground, nodding in understanding. Another adjusts his hat, eyes narrowing as he studies the supposed legend standing before him. The station agent, wiping his hands on his apron, hesitates for a moment before making his way over. Soon, the entire platform hums with the energy of an unfolding tale. McIntosh lifts his chin ever so slightly, savoring the moment. Another town. Another audience. Another chance to spin his web. Scene 2, the fairground performance. A large canvas tent flaps gently in the evening breeze, lanterns casting a flickering glow on the eager faces of the gathered townspeople. The air smells of sawdust, popcorn, and the faint scent of horses from a nearby corral. Wooden benches creak under the weight of spectators, a mix of ranchers, merchants, and wide-eyed children sitting cross-legged near the stage. At the center, a wooden stage stands proudly, worn from years of performances. Atop it, McIntosh stands tall, his dark coat swaying slightly as he closes his eyes, as if summoning visions of the past. McIntosh, dramatic, voice thick with emotion, that day, the dust, the war cries, the endless waves of Sioux and Cheyenne. He pauses, inhaling deeply as if transported back in time. The audience leans in, holding their breath. McIntosh, I alone carried Custer's final message. But Major Reno, he was a coward of the worst kind. Had he answered Custer's call, history would have been written differently. Gasps ripple through the crowd. A man near the front shakes his head, muttering about Reno's cowardice. A woman clutches her husband's arm, her eyes wide with admiration and disbelief. They loved Custer. They wanted to believe he had fought for them, died for them. McIntosh gave them the story they craved. A hush falls as a woman in the second row raises her hand hesitantly. Her face, lined with years of hardship, reflects a mix of skepticism and reverence. "Woman, what happened after?" Mr. Curley. A few heads turn, waiting for his answer. McIntosh lowers his voice, his expression darkening as if recalling a painful past. McIntosh, somber, I wandered for days, surviving by sheer will. The spirits guided me back to my people. He exhales heavily, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over his audience. Then, his tone shifts, calculated, deliberate. McIntosh, and now I serve as an Indian agent. I have seen what is coming. The government will soon open Crow land for homesteading. It is an opportunity, one that only a select few can seize. A murmur spreads among the men in the crowd. Some exchange intrigued glances. Others nod, considering his words carefully. A rancher in the back strokes his chin, deep in thought. He had them hooked. The promise of land, of being part of history, was too tempting to ignore. A man in a dusty hat leans forward, his curiosity outweighing his skepticism. Man, you say you can offer land, Mr. Curley? At what price? McIntosh lets the moment hang in the air, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd, gauging their eagerness. McIntosh, softly, an exclusive price. But only to those who act swiftly. The land will not wait, nor will history. A few more murmurs, now laced with excitement. The energy in the tent shifts from awe to opportunity. McIntosh smiles inwardly. This town, like so many before, was his for the taking. Scene 3, the con unravels. A cold November morning. A sharp wind howls through the barren trees as frost clings to the wooden fence posts lining the dirt road. J.C. McCoy and J.H. Orr, wrapped tightly in wool coats, approach the weathered gates of the Crow Reservation in Montana. Their boots crunch against the frozen ground, each step carrying the weight of suspicion. The reservation appears quiet, save for the distant barking of dogs and the occasional clatter of wooden shutters against the cold wind. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys, dissipating into the gray sky. A sense of unease lingers as McCoy and Orr exchange wary glances. McCoy, shouting over the wind, "We're looking for Curley the Crow. He owes us money. Said he'd take us bear hunting." A Crow tribesman, wrapped in a thick buffalo hide, steps forward. His dark eyes assess the two men before he slowly lifts his arm, pointing toward an elderly man sitting motionless on a wooden bench. The old man, dressed in a simple wool coat and moccasins, stares blankly at the frozen ground. Crow tribesman, that is Curley. He does not speak English. McCoy and Orr freeze in place. Their breath forms small clouds in the cold air as they stare at the frail figure before them. The man's face, deeply lined with age and wisdom, bears little resemblance to the charismatic storyteller who had captivated them back in Nebraska. The realization dawns on them like a slow, creeping shadow. Their expressions shift from confusion to shock. Their trusted guide, the man who had spun vivid tales of battle and survival, was nothing more than an illusion. The man they had trusted, the legend they had believed, was a lie. Orr's fingers tremble as he reaches into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded piece of parchment. It's an old flyer, worn at the edges, with the name Curley the Crow scrawled beneath an artist's rendering of a strong, broad-shouldered man. Orr looks back at the elderly figure before him, the reality hitting like a hammer to the chest. A few steps away, something catches McCoy's eye. A small cemetery, its wooden crosses barely standing against the wind, sits in quiet repose. Drawn by an unspoken force, he walks toward it, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. His breath hitches as he stops in front of a single, weathered gravestone. McCoy, voice hoarse, "Orr, over here." Orr joins him, his eyes scanning the crude lettering etched into the stone. His stomach tightens as he reads aloud. Orr, reading, "Ben McIntosh." A long pause stretches between them. Their breaths are ragged, their hands clench into fists. The truth is inescapable now. Neither name was real. The man they had admired, the hero they had trusted, had never existed at all. The wind howls louder, carrying their disbelief into the vast emptiness beyond. Scene 4, The Hunt for McIntosh. A dimly lit telegram office in Edgar, Nebraska. The smell of ink and aged paper fills the air as a telegraph operator hunches over his desk, fingers flying across the keys of the Morse transmitter. The rhythmic clicking fills the small room. Telegraph operator, muttering, "Curley the Crow, impersonator, hold at Edgar Station." Sweat beads at his temple as he glances toward the clock on the wall. The train will be arriving soon, and the town marshal had made it clear this time, McIntosh wasn't slipping away. A distant train whistle echoes through the cold morning air. Outside, steam rises from the iron tracks, curling and dissipating into the sky as the locomotive roars closer. Two officers stand at the platform, hands resting on their holsters. Their eyes scan the passengers as they disembark. The tension is thick, their breath visible in the crisp air. A few townsfolk linger nearby, curiosity piqued by the unspoken promise of excitement. The train hisses to a stop. The doors open, and people shuffle out, clutching their coats against the bite of the wind. Among them, stepping down with deliberate ease, is a man in a well-pressed coat and a broad-brimmed hat. He moves with the grace of someone who knows how to command attention. He tips his hat slightly, offering the faintest of smiles, a confidence carefully cultivated. The moment they had been waiting for had arrived. The two officers step forward, cutting through the dispersing crowd. One of them, a grizzled man with sharp eyes, clears his throat. "Officer, you're under arrest." A hush falls over the platform. A few murmurs ripple through the onlookers, heads turning toward the unfolding scene. McIntosh's smile falters, but only for a fraction of a second. He quickly regains his composure, adjusting his coat as if merely inconvenienced. "McIntosh," smoothly, "gentlemen, there must be a misunderstanding." His voice is even, measured. He places a gloved hand over his chest, feigning disbelief. The grizzled officer is unmoved. He steps closer, pulling a folded telegram from his pocket and holding it up. "Officer," firmly, "this says otherwise. Curley the Crow, impersonator, swindler. Seems your story's finally caught up to you, McIntosh." McIntosh's jaw tightens for the briefest of moments, but he lets out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "McIntosh, scoffing, impersonator? I have only ever told the truth. What crime is it to share one's history?" The second officer pulls a pair of handcuffs from his belt. A flicker of something crosses McIntosh's face, annoyance, perhaps, or calculation. "Officer 2, you can explain that to the judge." The sound of the cuffs clicking shut around his wrists is final, the air suddenly feeling colder. The crowd watches in silence as the once great storyteller, the supposed last witness to Custer's demise, is led away from the platform. And so, the legend of Curley the Crow began to unravel at last. As the officers escort McIntosh toward a waiting carriage, his eyes scan the crowd. Searching. Perhaps for sympathy. Perhaps for another opportunity. But for the first time in years, there is none. Scene 5, The Final Trick. A dimly lit jail cell in Illinois, December 1915. The air is damp, thick with the scent of iron bars and cold stone. A single lantern flickers from the hallway, casting long shadows across the walls. McIntosh leans casually against the bars, his hands resting lightly on the cold metal as he studies the man sitting just outside the cell, a visitor, dressed in a fine wool coat, his expression hesitant but intrigued. McIntosh tilts his head, a knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. His voice is smooth, persuasive, barely above a whisper. "McIntosh," softly, "you're a man of vision. You understand the power of stories." The visitor shifts in his seat, adjusting his coat as if the weight of McIntosh's words presses on him. He listens, captivated. "McIntosh, let me show you the truth," if you'll only help me get to Montana. He leans forward, his dark eyes gleaming in the dim light. His voice is steady, filled with the conviction of a man who has bent fate to his will time and time again. McIntosh, can't. Out there, I have land, wealth, connections. The government trusts me with the affairs of my people. But I am needed. And right now, I find myself detained by unfortunate circumstances. The visitor's brow furrows. He glances toward the jailer, who stands a few feet away, arms crossed, uninterested in the conversation. McIntosh senses the hesitation and presses on, lowering his voice even more. McIntosh, whispering, "You wouldn't let a man of honor rot in a place like this, would you? Think of what you stand to gain: a personal ally on the frontier, someone who knows the land, the business, the opportunities." The visitor exhales, conflicted. His fingers tap anxiously against his knee. Finally, after a long pause, he nods. "Visitor, quietly, what do I need to do?" McIntosh straightens, a slow, victorious smile forming. He reaches his hand through the bars, and the visitor, after a moment's hesitation, shakes it. A few hours later, the iron lock clicks open. Footsteps echo through the empty hallway as McIntosh steps out, adjusting his coat as if merely leaving a meeting rather than escaping incarceration. Even in chains, he found a way to escape. The visitor watches as McIntosh disappears into the cold night, his silhouette swallowed by the mist curling through the streets. He realizes, too late, that he has just unleashed a legend back into the world. Scene 6, a final performance. A grand stage in Chicago. The theater is packed, the warm glow of chandeliers reflecting off gilded balconies. The air hums with excitement as men and women, dressed in their finest evening attire, settle into their seats. Some sip whiskey, others fan themselves with folded programs, eager for the spectacle to begin. The deep red velvet curtain sways slightly, catching the draft from the hushed whispers below. From behind the curtain, a figure emerges: McIntosh, dressed in full regalia. He wears a beaded jacket, a feathered headpiece, and a sash that drapes over his broad shoulders. He moves with the confidence of a man who has held audiences in the palm of his hand for years. As he steps to the center of the stage, he lifts his chin, spreading his arms wide. McIntosh, booming, Custer was a great man. His memory must be honored. The crowd erupts in applause, a few men standing in admiration. Women nod approvingly, their eyes alight with reverence. For them, this is more than just a speech, it is a glimpse into history itself. McIntosh basks in the energy, pausing just long enough to let the moment settle before continuing. McIntosh, passionate, I stood by his side, heard his last words. I carried his message across enemy lines. And now I bring you the truth, the story they don't want you to hear. A murmur of excitement rolls through the audience. Heads nod. They hang on his every word. Then rustling. A crisp newspaper unfolds in the third row. A man adjusts his glasses, squinting at the bold black letters printed across the front page. He clears his throat, reading aloud, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. Man in crowd, loudly, Curley the Crow imposter unmasked. A ripple spreads through the theater. The applause falters. Murmurs of confusion and doubt grow in volume. People turn to one another, whispering, their expressions shifting from admiration to suspicion. A woman gasps, clutching her pearl necklace. A man frowns, scanning the stage more closely. But this time, the lie had run its course. McIntosh stiffens. His grip on his sash tightens. For the first time, the unwavering confidence in his eyes flickers. He raises his hand, as if to regain control, as if to drown out the spreading doubt. McIntosh, forcing a chuckle, lies. Slander spread by those who do not know the truth. But the energy in the room has changed. Suspicion lingers. A few men rise from their seats, folding their arms. The murmurs do not stop. The crowd is no longer spellbound, they are watching him now, scrutinizing every movement. McIntosh shifts on his feet, beads of sweat forming at his temple. The grand stage, once his domain, now feels smaller, the walls closing in. He scans the crowd, looking for an ally, for a sign of belief. But there is none. Scene 7, Justice at Last. A grand courtroom in Kansas. The wooden pews are filled with spectators, some clutching newspapers bearing the headline of McIntosh's deception. The air is thick with anticipation, the weight of justice pressing down on every soul in the room. Sunlight filters through tall windows, casting long shadows over the polished wooden floor. At the center of it all, Ben McIntosh stands with his hands clasped in front of him, his face unreadable. Behind the bench, the judge, an older man with piercing eyes and a weathered face, adjusts his spectacles. He exhales deeply, studying McIntosh with an expression that is equal parts disappointment and condemnation. "Judge, you have defrauded countless people. You have stolen history itself." A murmur ripples through the gallery. Some nod in agreement, others sit stiffly, their arms crossed in anger. A few victims of McIntosh's schemes shift uncomfortably, the sting of betrayal still fresh. McIntosh, however, does not flinch. His hands remain steady, his expression composed. He tilts his head slightly, his voice smooth, controlled. "McIntosh, calmly, Your Honor, I have only given the people what they wanted." A hush falls over the courtroom. The words hang in the air, audacious yet strangely compelling. A woman in the front row gasps. A man clenches his jaw, shaking his head. The judge's gaze sharpens. He leans forward, his fingers tapping against the wooden gavel resting beside him. "Judge," firmly, "you have manipulated the hopes of honest men and women. You have used deception to enrich yourself, preying on those who trusted you." A pause. The weight of the moment lingers. Then, the judge straightens, his voice resolute. "Judge, you are sentenced to a year in Leavenworth prison." The gavel strikes. A single, resounding crack that echoes through the silent room. A collective sigh washes over the gallery. Relief for some, anger for others. McIntosh, for the first time, lowers his eyes. He exhales slowly, as if finally grasping that his long con has reached its end. Two officers step forward, placing heavy hands on his shoulders. The courtroom doors creak open as they lead him away, the sound of shackles rattling against the floor. McIntosh does not resist, but his mind is already working, already calculating his next move. For a man who had always lived by his words, silence now followed him into the cold stone walls of Leavenworth Prison *. Scene 8, The Final Days. A train station in Ogden, Utah, 1921. The platform is quiet, save for the occasional hiss of steam from the arriving locomotive. A thin mist hangs in the air, mixing with the soot and the distant murmur of passengers waiting for their trains. The once grand station, now worn from years of use, hums with subdued energy.